Test.
Yep, that's it.
Test, test. You're on.
Okay, good. So you're right to go?
Because otherwise I'd be...
There's only 3 copies left.
Can you get more or not?
No, they're not republishing it.
No, right. So can everybody please come in so we can get started?
I don't know what it's like.
Good evening, Lois. It's Malcolm here.
And how are you?
Very
It was
well.
nice to hear you were coming.
By a rare appearance.
What more room? Can you sign in for Dad?
Good evening, everybody. And welcome to our meeting here tonight. It's good to see so many people here. So it's being live streamed as well, so we welcome everybody on live stream as well. And we're looking at some aspects of Pastor Scheerer's work in Central Australia. And it's very pleasing that there are a number of Pastor Scheerer's family here. So you want to put your hands up, for those of you who are part of the family? Right up so we can see who you are. Okay, look, welcome, and if there's any that are watching live stream, welcome to you as well. And of course we especially welcome our guest speaker tonight, and I'll speak about him in a moment. Maybe you know or don't know, but this past week our former archivist, Lyle Kupke's mother passed away. She passed away on Monday night. She reached the age of 103 years. So if Lyle is watching this live stream, we extend our sincere sympathy to him and his family. My understanding is that her funeral will be at Glynde at 1 o'clock on Tuesday, and I presume it'll be in the Advertiser on Saturday. But yeah, so, and you know, our current archivist, she lost her father too earlier this year, Rachel. So we all live in hope, don't we? So it's one of those sad things, but she lived a great life. Now I'll call on Shirley to speak briefly about our next meeting before we get stuck into tonight's meeting.
Thank you. Guest speaker next week will be Valerie Volk. Next month. Next one, sorry. Thank you. Valerie is a renowned author, particularly since she retired from teaching at Emmanuel. And she returns to the setting of one of her previous books. This is her 12th book. The previous book was In Search of Anna, the German farming community, in the German farming community of Jindera in New South Wales, to present the story of Emma, an old, domineering, cold and difficult to love woman who sets out to rediscover her old self and to reclaim her future through the journal she has kept for 60 years. Now, I'm still reading it, and it's an excellent read, very easy to read, and she writes exceptionally well. So I encourage people to come and listen to Valerie next month.
Thank you. Now we come to tonight's topic, and we're very privileged to have Dr. David Moore from Alice Springs here and his wife. And he'll speak more about his life rather than me tell the wrong story. But he is a linguist, translator and interpreter of Aboriginal languages. His main interests are in descriptive linguistics, variation, forensic linguistics, Aboriginal languages, etc. And so he spent a lot of time up there, and you may recall last year he was a guest speaker here as well, and he spoke about Adolf Heinrich at a meeting there in here, and he mentioned to me at that time that there's possibly 3 people he could speak about in topics for our meetings, and tonight Pastor Scherer is the second of those. And so he's not going to concentrate on his whole life, so the family will know more about his life than what you hear tonight. But he did a lot of important work in Central Australia as a missionary up there, and David is going to speak more about it. So please welcome Dr. David Moore. Must be cold here, he's still got his cap on.
Thanks, Jeff. Thanks. Thanks for the privilege of addressing you tonight and talking about Philip Scherer. I'm in the company of people who know more about Scherer than what I do. So I'm just going to grab a notebook because I'll be taking notes. There's always something to learn and a lot more that can be learned. And as Scherer wrote about 20 books, there's quite a marathon in reading what he actually wrote, not to mention all the numerous letters that are in Central Australia and in the Lutheran archives. A few months back I came down to look at the Philip Scherer archive collection in the Lutheran archives, and there was only one box. And so I got through that fairly quickly. I think a lot of the other papers and documents have gone to the National Library. But one of the reasons why we want to talk about the legacy of Philip Scherer is because he probably has been undervalued in a way. We've heard of other people, we haven't heard of Philip Scherer. We've tended to hear more about the Strellos, for example. So hopefully it'll be a good discussion. This is really a work in progress. Like I say, there's a lot to learn. And I was actually even thinking of an alternative title for tonight's talk. So I'll just bring this one up. Yeah. So we got that. There we go. Where am I pointing it at? Just, yeah. Let's go back a couple of slides. Yeah, I think an alternative talk could be something like Scherer, missionary rouseabout. Rouseabout is a word that he used in a book that he wrote, and I think it describes his fairly mobile and fairly large number of different interests and occupations over his lifetime. He never really stayed anywhere longer than about 7 years during his career. And like I say, there's a lot to learn about Philip Scherer, and I've been helped greatly by Anne Scherer and Olga Radke and David Hewitt. David Hewitt sadly passed away earlier this year, who've been part of the Old Church historical group. And I've also had a lot of discussions with other people who are doing research and have helped me out with letters. Clara Stockett, Paul Watson, and also Jeff Zagenschnitter have helped me out with documents and finding material. Can we have the next slide, please? So Philip Scherer's family, his father was a pastor, Philip Scherer, born in 1866. He arrived in Australia in 1900 to be the pastor at Rheintal. He married Agnes Rodiger, and there are 11 children. I think I'm getting this basically right.
Can I add to that, David?
Yes? So, right, thanks for that. So he was trained by the Hermannsburg Missionary Society, and so when he came to Australia, other Hermannsburg trained missionaries like Hofner and the two that had come out, there was two that were trained by Hermannsburg Mission Society. They were not able to go to Hermannsburg in the Northern Territory, but took on parishes. Hosfeld took on Dutton and Neils Flat, and Hofner, I think, was another parish around Cambrai. But they were trained by the Hermannsburg Mission Society, and they couldn't continue on with being missionaries, so they then took on parishes in South Australia when the ELSA stopped supporting Hermannsburg Mission in the Northern Territory. Yeah. FoLA. So, okay. Yep. Okay, so the last talk I gave was about Hermann Heinrich, who was a teacher at Hermannsburg for about 15 years. So I'm just tying in with my previous talk, which was April last year, which Jeff mentioned. And the Heinrichs and the Scherers, I think, knew each other in about the 1950s, and there's many threads in common between the two families. Heinrich, although a generation apart, Heinrich was born in 1895, and Philip Scherer was born in 1920. But Heinrich's one of those sort of undervalued people who was often thought to be like just a hopeless young fellow when he had to take over the mission, the running of the Hermannsburg mission in 1922, October 1922, after the death of missionary Carl Strello at Horseshoe Bend. Heinrich taught a class of about 52 students at Hermannsburg, and he also did pack horse trips through the McDonnell Ranges. And as a result of the work of Anne Scherer and finding the old visitors book at Hermannsburg, some of these comments and some of these visitors' comments have been found. This is one from Professor Walter Geisler, who said, thanks for the wonderful trip, lovely excursions in the mountains, which will always be my best memories. And Geisler wrote this book in 1928 about his time travelling through Hermannsburg and through the centre of Australia. And at one point, he sees Heinrich making a damper, making bread without yeast, and he talks about this bushman, ein Bushman kann alles, a bushman can do anything. This was the last talk in April last year. So Geisler writes this book, and it turns out that Heinrich wasn't so hopeless after all. He was actually a multi-skilled, multi-capable type of person who was running Hermannsburg at the age of about 27, doing many, many things, not just teaching in the school, but a person that we should pay more attention to. And I think Philip Adolf Scherer is also in this category. And the details I just mentioned earlier about Philip Scherer Senior coming out after studying theology at the Hermannsburg Mission Institute, and marrying Agnes Marie Rodiger, who is from Buxfelder. There's a bit of a theme and a bit of a thread through these talks that we've had in the last couple of years, is that a number of them have related to the town of Gawler. There was the talk about Ephraim Coombe, and there was the Heinrichs who retired in Gawler. So we've had a bit of a focus on Gawler in the last couple of years. And Philip Scherer has a couple of connections with Gawler, I think. His mother's family, the Rodigers, were at Buxfelder, and his wife was from Gawler. So I'm continuing this thread of Gawler discussions, as my ancestors were in Gawler, at Gawler River too, in the 19th century. Scherer wrote his school day memoirs. There's a couple of pages in the archive about his early life, and he was bilingual. He spoke German at home until he had to go to school at the age of 6. And he probably, I think, might have gone to a bilingual school if it hadn't been closed down a decade earlier, as the German schools were closed. 49 of them were closed in mid-1917. And 60 or so staff had to redeploy and do other things. Some, like Heinrich, actually became a teacher. He just became a teacher in a different school somewhere else, but he was one of the very few. And in fact, Heinrich went from one bilingual school to another bilingual school. He went from Nain, where he was in charge of 43 children in a bilingual German-English school, to Hermannsburg, where he was in charge of 52 students in an Arender English school. But I think he valued his German background, his German language especially, because it would be decisive and important throughout his entire life. His entire life was actually based on translation, and why I've entitled this Translator and Historian is a lot of the historical work he did was in the later part of his life, but it was based on translations that he did in the first part of his life. He often translated a missionary's records or diary or journal, and then he wrote a book like Venture of Faith, for example, which is based on the journal of A.H. Kemper, I think. Is that right? It's basically one man's story, and hopefully there'll be more journals and letters and records of A.H. Kemper coming out soon. But Scherer had a kind of a knack for understanding the significance of things. He understood that a lot of the records are just laying there and they were not available to people to read about. The Hermannsburg story just hadn't really been fully explored, perhaps by some others, but he realised that the key to it lay in translation, and he needed to translate these early journals so that people could read this story of the first Hermannsburg missionaries and their 21-month trip from Bethany in South Australia, starting in 1875, and then arriving in early June at Hermannsburg in the Northern Territory, where they founded a mission station. Maybe just hold that book up. If this book, Venture of Faith, is that book. To know more than one language has its distinct advantages. I think that there's all kinds of advantages in being bilingual, but for him it was absolutely crucial. So I'm not going to talk too much about his early education, which was in a monolingual school, I think it was, and through Emmanuel College, he did study language right throughout his high school and college days. He studied Latin, German, further German, honours German, and he studied Greek. And so he had a really thoroughly what you might call a humanistic education. I was going to say that he was also instrumental in starting some what we might call migrant congregations, particularly the Estonians, but there were other migrant groups as well, which he encouraged congregations to start amongst migrant people in Sydney and in Victoria, right. And another aspect of Scherer's life is, so he had this training in theology and in ancient languages, which is very suitable for understanding and the work that he would do later. But he also sought out training, and throughout his life he did 2 periods of training which I think are really important. One was that he went to Sydney, so while he was locum tenens in Sydney, he was also studying at Sydney University and learning linguistics and anthropology from probably the best people we could learn from at that time, Arthur Capel and A.P. Elkin. So Elkin taught him anthropology and Capel taught him linguistics. These are the best places. Sydney was the best place you could learn these disciplines and learn about how to understand Aboriginal cultures and Aboriginal languages from people who had a lot of fieldwork experience. And that would be true until the 1950s. Yes, I seem to have got up to about 1944, 45 is when he first went to Hermannsburg to be assistant missionary and to fill in for Sam Gross, who was away for about 5 months. So he was assistant to F.W. Albrecht at that time. Around that time he would have gone to Haas Bluff and was at Jay Creek Aboriginal Reserve as well. Returning to Hermannsburg, and he was the first resident missionary at Arayonga, and throughout that time, 1946-47, he was working on this dictionary, and this appeared in 1947. So in the 1930s and 40s, increasingly the church is in English, and there are pastors who don't speak German. Karl Strollo's dictionary is based on German and literature and Aranda. And this is the manuscript that he would have worked from, probably the very manuscript which is now in the Strollo Research Centre. On the left-hand column is German, and then there are equivalents for about 7,600 Aranda words, and alongside them are some 6,400 literature words. Karl Strollo had compiled this dictionary in 1909, and he had intended it to go with his Die Aranda and Literature Stimme, which is his 5-volume work. The dictionary was going to be part of that, and there was going to be grammars that would go alongside that as well. So that someone reading the Die Aranda, the book which was about the culture and languages and myths of Aranda people, they could look up words themselves in the dictionary. They can understand the Aranda language better. By the 1940s and 50s, there was a need to translate this into English, as missionaries and a lot of pastors were predominantly using English. So this was one of the works that Scherer produced. We'll go back to here. A vocabulary of the Aranda and Luritja native languages of Central Australia with English equivalents. And so he made 4 of these, and must have been an enormous amount of work, not only to translate the German into English, working at Arionga where he wouldn't have probably had a lot of resources to help him, wouldn't have had online translation programs and probably a minimum of dictionaries. And then to type this work and make it in 4 copies. The 4 copies went into 4 mission houses in Central Australia. And I think one of them ended up in the Australian Institute of Aboriginal Studies in Canberra, but there was copies in Yuendumu, Arionga and Hermannsburg. This copy belonged to Pastor Sam Gross, who passed it on to Max Stolzner, who passed it on to Ken Hansen, who gave it to me in 2022. Last year, when Ken Hansen launched his own dictionary, which was about a 2,000-page, 2-volume dictionary of Luritja, which is one of the languages in this book. In a dictionary like this, which Strela was working on, there are all kinds of entries for all kinds of things which have to be understood. For example, this word in Aranda, erutacha, I haven't actually been able to find it in any modern dictionaries or find any speakers who still know this word, but it's described as a maikäfer by Strela. The picture there is not a Central Australian beetle, but that's the maikäfer of Germany. And it's interesting he translates that as a maybug. I'm pretty sure, does anyone know much about maikäfers? Are there a cockchafer or maybug or maybeetle that lives in Germany? Ladybird? I thought this was a specific beetle that turns up about May every year. I can just remember this is the first word I learned in German after our German friends in Stuttgart gave me a chocolate one. And I always wondered what the real ones were, what the actual animal was, because they talked about this maikäfer. A bird that's been kind of talked about a lot, and there are now numerous expeditions all over Australia to try and find it, as it's turned up in about 4 or 5 different states, probably Queensland, SA, the night parrot, and this is the kind of ecological knowledge which is found in this book. The Nukul Dulbara, or night parrot, which was probably not that uncommon around Hermannsburg, although very elusive, about 100 years ago, and it was recorded and appears in this dictionary. So after spending time in Central Australia and gaining a lot of experience in learning Aboriginal languages, and especially Aranda, and after going to Victoria and taking on the role as a parish pastor in 1948, Scherer went back. He was thinking of going back and was going to work on Aranda translation, and he'd actually been working on the 4 Gospels, which had been done by Carl Strello back in the between 1913 and 1919, but were in need of revision. So Carl Strello's son Ted took on that role of revising the entire Bible, or entire New Testament, and Scherer was very much engaged in that work around the late 1940s. He goes back to Melbourne, Doncaster, and East Gippsland and Melbourne, and then he goes to, apparently, I'm not exactly sure when this started, but he claims, I think, to have been involved with the Summer Institute of Linguistics since it started in Melbourne, which was 1950. It was 1950 when Ken Pike came to Australia and started teaching the techniques, the methods of field linguistics, modern linguistics, at Belgrave Heights. So Philip Scherer has a really advanced training in linguistics in the 1950s. I think he keeps in touch with the Summer Institute of Linguistics, and then he actually enrolls and does a course there for about 3 months, 11 weeks. So a number of other Lutheran missionaries were there as well. I think this is really important because at this very point, Philip Scherer actually had more advanced training in linguistics than what Ted Strello did. Ted Strello really was part of an earlier kind of linguist, a type of linguistics which was based on mainly written materials and not on field work. And this organisation, which was based in the United States, its aim was to train people in translation and train them in crash courses in linguistics so that they could translate languages of the world. And they aimed to translate hundreds and thousands of languages of the world, all the languages of the world actually. So they gave people like Philip Scherer a lot of insight into how language works and how to analyse and translate languages. I think it's probably important to take account of this because I've never actually read much about Lutheran missionaries and translation in books about translation. There's a lot about translation experience from other countries of the world, particularly North and South America, very American focused, very focused on SIL. But people like Philip Scherer actually had enormous experience in learning languages like Aranda, which is a very difficult language to learn, and applying linguistic insights to that language. We just haven't seen it much in the literature. Oh, there's something there too that around that time Strello had published, 1947, he published a pamphlet called Anthropology and the Study of Languages, which is probably the best work that he published, and that was a huge benefit to people in the Summer Institute of Linguistics. And Scherer recommended that everybody read it. So even though Scherer was going to the Summer Institute of Linguistics in Melbourne and learning a lot, he also would have contributed a lot because he, unlike probably a number of the people who were studying there, actually had real experience living with people who spoke really different languages. These are not European languages, they're not Indo-European languages, they're very different from what people were used to. So he actually does linguistic analysis of Hindi language. That's part of one of the exercises they do. They go to the Summer Institute and study a language and analyse it. How do we analyse the structure of a language like Hindi? He writes to Ted Strello and says he's working on this language, Kalagan, a language spoken in the Philippines. And these are just exercises to get the student thinking about a radically different language. And how do we actually understand it? How do we learn the language? And then how do we translate the Bible into that language? I thought this comment was interesting that he'll now know how to tackle fieldwork and learn Aranda as a living language, because I think his experience in the field, he definitely would have been learning Aranda as a living language up to that time. But he was perhaps learning new insights and learning how to understand languages in new ways. But this training was the direction that Australian linguistics was going in the 1950s. And so he was really ahead of the game there. I think that he really understood where good training and learning was to be found. He meets Wilf Douglas, and Wilf Douglas, of all Australian linguists, had enormous experience working in the languages of the Western Desert and had worked in Uldea and Warburton Ranges and learned how to understand Pidginjarra and languages like that. So Scherer met him and talked about him. They were about the same age, and Douglas's paper on the sounds of the Western Desert language was just a first for Australian linguists, understanding the most significant and important sounds in a language and how to describe them. Around this time, the work of Otto Siebert was being discussed, because Siebert had been a missionary at Lake Kilalpanina, Bethesda, until the early 1900s when he went back to Germany. But Siebert in the 1950s was looking to sell a lot of his collection. And so they were talking about this Siebert collection and trying to keep it within the kind of missionary sphere. Back in Central Australia again, and learning Aranda reading from Colin Malbunka, and living at Haas Bluff, which is actually a Luritja-speaking area, but Aranda is a kind of language of wider communication for people, the kind of lingua franca of the Lutheran mission. And learning Aranda grammar from Alwyn. And writing papers on translation, where he discusses a lot of the insights that he's getting in the field, working with people, the importance of native idiom in Bible translation. Just going to mention it. And the Scherer family. Right. So there was four of you. Yep. 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 Yeah. It's great that you're here, Andrew, Sonia, and family. Yep. Yeah. So The chronology is pretty difficult because, like I said, Scherer moves around a lot, and so I know he took sick leave around 56, 57 or around that time, got hepatitis and went away from the field, went south, and then came up again to be missionary again, and was thinking of going to Haas Bluff again, but went to Hermannsburg instead. Field conferences, there were just numerous field conferences according to Olga Radke, who was there around that time, the 1960s. This one at Ernabella had the leaders of most of the missions in Central Australia at it. Kaleski was at Arionga, and after Shearer's time there in 46, 47 would have stayed for how long, Gordon? How long did Leo and Lydia Kaleski stay at Arionga for?
43 or 44 years.
Yep. Bill Edwards was at Ernabella for a long time, died in 2015. Petering was at Papunya and Hermannsburg, or just Papunya. F.W. Albrecht, Hermannsburg and Alice Springs. Laurie Rees at Yuendamu, Walpuri country, in the Baptist mission. And Tom Fleming, also at Yuendamu, actually Rees was probably at Ali Kurung and places like that. I think Rees and Fleming were Baptist missionaries. Edwards was Presbyterian, but there was all these kinds of gatherings which involve missionaries from different denominations getting together, ecumenical events really, and also choirs getting together, and as well as Aboriginal people coming together as well from different churches. And I think Philip Scherer thrived in that kind of environment, where collegial kind of environments. So on the map there, the area where Rees and Fleming were is the green part near the middle of Australia, and a large blue triangle, the Aranda region, with a number of different Aranda dialects. The orange part to the left of the blue triangular shape is the Luritja area. And then the languages to the west of Luritja, that entire region is the Western Desert, with about a large number of different dialects. So Philip Scherer was also involved in a lot of commemorations, and one event that's been commemorated just recently in Alice Springs is the mission journey of 3 Aboriginal evangelists to the west, about 200 miles to the west, to take the gospel to Luritja people, and Luritja people who are beyond Hermannsburg mission. So these men wrote letters to the mission board. They wrote them in Aranda. They had to be translated. I think Heinrich did the translations, and they wanted to take the Christian message far to the west. I think the mission board's ideas were different to what the 3 men had. I think the mission board wanted them to go about 600 miles, but they ended up being away for about 2 months. And during that time, they laid the foundations for new churches, because the churches of Haas Bluff, Papunya and Kintor go back to that early mission work. So that happened in August 1923, And then that was followed up by F.W. Albrecht and Titus and Martin, who went through there in 1930. So these letters have just been recently looked at by the archives, I think. They've just been translated from Aranda, and I think one of the projects of the archives is to look at this particular time in mission history. So Scherer, working with Dudley McNamara, who told a number of stories in Aranda, and a number of publications have been made from that. A number of other books and publications which Scherer wrote, which came out of his mission experience, and it seemed really interesting, like how, for example, did he end up writing about the Heffernans, the people who ran the Tea Tree establishment or roadhouse. I think it was when he was at Haas Bluff, part of his circuit was to travel to the north, and he went to Mudgera country where he met the Heffernans and made friends with them and wrote letters to the Heffernans and kept in touch over decades, and then ended up writing down their story. Without that kind of record, I think we'd almost have no information about that area, because I haven't really seen any histories that have been written. So with all of the books, 20 or so books that Scherer wrote, typed out and published, there's a lot of material that's never been really recorded anywhere else. That seems to be completely unique. Of all subjects, people are the most interesting. He tells the story of these characters, people like the Heffernans and a whole lot of other characters of the early days. He has that sense that if you don't write it down now or tape record it, it'll be gone forever. And something we could all learn from. You know, I could learn a lot from Philip Scherer, because he seemed to just find the right moment, and often in his books you read about, I was just talking to so-and-so and just happened to record what he said, and that turns out to be exactly the right time to be there. I'm not going to talk about his maps, because that would be quite a few different, take a long time. There's numerous maps that he made, including a map in that book, Venture of Faith, in the back of it. I think the second edition, the first edition was 3,000 copies and it sold out. So it came out in another edition, this one with maps and illustrations and more photographs. Yeah. Yeah.
If you do happen to have the original of the Venture of Faith, there is some value in that book, so keep hold of it. I think the last time I looked at it, when my father was alive before his death, it was valued at about $85 back then. So if you do have the first edition, yeah, be careful that if you do lend it to someone, get it back.
Thanks. So there are numerous maps, and at one point Scherer is working on translating hymns, and he reports back to Ted Strello that the diacritics, that's the little marks that indicate the sounds in Aranda, that the people are not happy with this. And, you know, do you think it's wise to have all these marks disfiguring the hymns? But he also talks about the value of a scientific, or thoroughness of a scientific mind. So, for example, in the 1964 hymnal, yeah, this one, it's all diacritics. And it took a long time to publish this book, just like it took a long time to publish the 1956 Bible because of the special fonts that needed to be cut to make these diacritical marks. As the training that Philip Scherer did in the 1950s had kind of shown, a lot of this phonetic detail is actually completely unnecessary. And about 10 years later, that would be a widely acknowledged fact. And John Fitzner was probably the one who got rid of diacritics. And yet this was an argument that kind of raged in the 1960s. Anyone? Yeah. Do you want to sing this song? All right. So the little marks that are underneath each letter that indicate different sounds in Aranda, typically sounds that don't exist in English. So, for example, when the N has a mark underneath it, that's a sound that's not a significant sound in English. It's an interdental or N kind of sound, like N or N, like the N in English, but your teeth are up behind, your tongue is up behind your top teeth when you make this sound, an interdental sound. The previous mission orthography hadn't included all of these sounds. It hadn't. So Ted Strello had added these so that someone who didn't speak the language could pronounce Aranda very exactly. But for someone who does speak the language, they're really unnecessary. And eventually they were replaced by combinations of Roman letters, Roman script. And Susan's just saying we might just go through to the end. And does anyone know this song? Anyone from Alice Springs help us? Yeah? Yeah? Okay. All right. So someone might know the great Welsh hymn, Guide Me, O Thou Great Jehovah, translated by PAS. When you see PAS in the hymnal, the 1964, or the current hymnal, PAS is Philip Adolf Scherer. And when it's TGHS, it's Theodor Georg Heinrich Strelow. So they're often together, they often work together on hymns. And Philip Scherer translated something like 180 hymns in that hymnal. There's 334 hymns in that hymnal. He did about half of them. Sometimes they were retranslations. Sometimes they were completely new. And so I'll just read out the Aranda. We might have a go at it. Elj ekald ungwanganala yengana warijala rejingai Jehovah ngarai mana al-kurarinyai andutilai yenga kurata nalkarij nalbola. This is what we do at Alice Springs Lutheran Church on Sunday morning, as we have Aranda singing. Yep, you sing it. Susan? Guide me, O thou great Jehovah, pilgrim through this barren land. I am weak, but thou art mighty. Hold me with thy powerful hand. Bread of heaven, feed me feed me now and evermore. Il jekaranguanganala yengana worijalai rejingai Yehovah ngarai mana alkirarinyai do telai yenga korata nal kerichinal pola nal kerichinal pola. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Anthony, you want to?
Philip Scherer actually got a typewriter and added points for when he's typing to write to translate your other language. But I don't know where the typewriter is anymore. Do you know of its existence?
I would think that Ted Strello, so Ted Strello had to get these fonts cut. I think they were cut in England, and that's one of the reasons why he was working on the Art in the New Testament came out in 1956, was published by the British and Foreign Bible Society. But he'd been working on it for a decade or more before that, but had to wait for the fonts and the special typewriter, special typesetting. And that's one of the reasons why Ted Strello's Songs of Central Australia took until 1971 to appear, even though he'd been working on it in the 1950s, was because it all has these diacritics which take so much extra work to actually produce. And as I say, they're actually in a time when phonetics was important, and a time when J.A. Fitzherbert was his mentor, and where the maximum number of sound distinctions was being written for the scientific community, for the people who didn't speak Aranda, who needed to have a maximum number of distinctions, and also the idea that the language was fading away and needed to be spoken exactly. So you'd have to have all these distinctions. In the 1970s, that's unnecessary. They're all replaced with two-letter, three-letter word combinations, three-letter or two-letter combinations instead of diacritics. So there's a whole argument there where Strello just says he's going to pull out of the hymn book project unless they have diacritics, because he's thoroughly committed to that. And so the field conference gives in to Strello. Scherer reports a favourable reaction from the mission staff who are willing to retain the diacritics. And so a lot of the background work was done by Philip Scherer, a lot of the locating of sources, identifying all those translations, especially the ones that were done by Aboriginal people with completely original tunes and were just in unpublished manuscripts all over the place. Scherer came in and just tidied all that up, and then that was the first hymnal for 40 years. So in 2024, it's the 60th anniversary of that hymnal, and it's the 100th anniversary of the one that Heinrich worked on with Moses Jalkapura and other people. And last time I talked about the literature hymns which were in the 1924 hymnal. And the 1964 hymnal added a lot more hymns that have been translated, particularly by these men. While he was still at Hermannsburg, Ted Strello invited Philip Scherer to work with him in Adelaide University, and then the idea was to create this dictionary and to draw maps. Maps would accompany the dictionary, and the dictionary would be probably the most comprehensive, largest collection of words ever of an Aboriginal language. There was a misunderstanding, or there was a disagreement at some point, and Scherer and Strello parted company, and Scherer left that job around 1966, I think it was. And more about this in a minute. I just discussing the book that came out, which Strello published, which was called Journey to Horseshoe Bend, because we were very engaged in studying the whole story of Carl Strello's death as he went to Horseshoe Bend. And I think that Philip Scherer wrote a really valuable piece. And it seems to me that he really came out to defend the mission board chair, J.J. Stolz, of the time. This has been taken up by Paul Albrecht in his pamphlet, Journey Broken at Horseshoe Bend. And Journey to Horseshoe Bend purports to be a factual account of what happened at Horseshoe Bend. It's also a polemical work because it attacks Stolz and Lutheran pastors, accusing them of being hypocrites and of going against 1 Corinthians 13, the law of love. And it's really worth asking how factual Strello's account really is. And I think that Scherer was in this stage of his life actually looking into questions like that. The dictionary project ended up becoming a whole lot of cards and files, but was never published. So in 1975, Peter Sutton, who was at the Aboriginal Institute, AIAS, wrote to Scherer to find out what's happened to the dictionary. It was supposed to be a dictionary with 33,000 entries. Scherer writes back, and it was widely reported, like in international literature, that this would be the most comprehensive dictionary of any Aboriginal language. It would have 33,000 entries. It didn't eventuate. Later on, after this book had been translated, for some reason Kath Strello decided to retranslate, or get a German prisoner in Wollongabba prison to retranslate Carl Strello's dictionary. And this was so that she could have her own copy, apparently, or could actually not acknowledge Philip Scherer, it seems to me. The letters that she wrote were vindictive and critical. It seems that she wanted to get the job that Philip Scherer had at Adelaide University in the 1960s. As she found her way into T.G.H. Strello's life, she also wanted to take over the Strello legacy or collection, and she talks about how she knows a church parson who has pirated the entire work, the dictionary, and passed it off under his own name. I think the Strello Foundation started in 1991, but there was this whole situation where I think Philip Scherer was not acknowledged. When Songs of Central Australia came out, his name doesn't appear there at all, even though he worked on maps and he worked on dictionary work. Instead, Kath Strello is acknowledged as the one who actually compiled the maps in Songs of Central Australia. And it seems as though the entire Strello collection became a possession of somebody who then sold it to the Northern Territory government, and the Northern Territory government bought what it thought was the Strello Centre, was the Strello collection. Later in his career, Scherer was thinking more and more about, I think, certain kinds of claims that had been made, particularly started focusing when he went to Blythe and Clare. He became interested in the Lassiter story. And I wondered, why was he interested in Lassiter's story? But then he'd lived in the area near where Lassiter died in the early 1930s. And when he went to Clare as a parish minister there, after he finished at Adelaide University, he met people who knew this Paul Johns, and that led to him writing this book called Lassiter Demystified and Two German Roustabouts. He did a lot of background sort of reading and research on Paul John, who was the last person to see Lassiter alive, and who's the one who got Lassiter the camel string that Lassiter rode before his death. And Scherer became aware that Paul John had been an employee of Hermannsburg Mission about 1929, and he'd been engaged to work there, and that's how he became interested in riding camels and how he got involved with Lassiter. But Scherer has some fairly harsh things to say about Lassiter because he sees him as basically a fraud, and he reads all the literature available on Lassiter, and there's numerous books that came out around this time, or around many decades after Lassiter's death, I should say. And so the two German roustabouts, the Herumstreicher roustabout, this photo here, the book about Paul John, and the book about the Lassiter claims. After Clare and Blythe, Philip Scherer went to the Australian Institute of Aboriginal Studies, translating Reuter's 12 volumes that were in German, translates them into English. And then from there to the Archives and Research Centre of the Lutheran Church of Australia, which became Lutheran Archives, and retired in 1989. This dictionary was launched last year, the first Western Aranda dictionary of this type, and subsequent editions of this will draw very much on the early work, the work of Scherer and others, and also of Ted Strello and Carl Strello and others. But we can do this kind of work because of the groundbreaking foundations that have been put down. So what can we say about Scherer's work? There's a lot more to say. There's a lot more research to do and a lot more thinking. And we can say that in so many ways, God used Philip Scherer and inspired him to do his works of translation, research, and writing history. And there are so many things that we wouldn't know or wouldn't have looked at if it hadn't been for what he was able to accomplish. And his work needs more attention, but that then sort of brings me to the next point, which is about the republication of Scherer's works. So, for example, the Scherer Papers, the Old Church Committee in Alice Springs have republished this one, which includes the Hermannsburg Chronicle and A Day in the Life of Hermannsburg. And this charts a history of Hermannsburg 1877 to 1933 and is the records that were kept at Hermannsburg. So many things can be found in here and so many stories are told in these books. So there's a hope that we'll bring out more of these books in the future. The correspondence will be the next one, the letters that were written from Hermannsburg, and then probably the Central Australian books which Scherer wrote will attempt to bring those back again. Because as Sonia identified, these works are getting rare and it'd be great to have them in circulation. What was that? Yep. Yeah. Any questions or comments?
Yes.
Yes, you showed the photo of Philip and his wife, but you didn't tell us her name or when they were married. Please.
Hang on.
My mother's name was Avis Bernice Mole, and she came from Dimboola in Victoria. And they were married on the 2nd of the 2nd, 1952. As was my sister was married on the 9th of the 9th, 89, and I was married on the 25th of the 5th, 85. So all of our marriages ended in significant numbers.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Yes.
Can I ask, when you sang the hymn and then you sang it in Arunta afterwards, can I ask the question, is the Arunta translation of the English word for word? Or is it a paraphrase?
I think that what we know now, actually what we know through the work of John Fitzner, who was the missionary pastor at Hermannsburg from 1969 to about 1984 or 5, about 15 years, was that the 1956 Strollo translation was actually really difficult, if not impossible, to understand. And it was translated at a time when literal translation was the norm and where word-for-word translation was done. Probably that great Jehovah hymn is pretty close to, it's not quite word for word, but it's probably more literal than what a translation would be these days. Back in those days, it was thought that you had to copy the structures of the original language. So, for example, Ted Strello went to Europe and Britain between 1950 and 1952. In 1950, when he got off the boat, he went into the British and Foreign Bible Society to get the latest version of the Greek so that he could work from Greek into Aranda, but he often completely replicates the structures of Greek in Aranda, word for word, absolutely word for word, in a way that no Aranda person would speak. No one has ever spoken like that in history. It's a highly artificial translation, and this hasn't really been said before because people don't want to tread on other people's toes. They don't want to tread on the Strello's toes, as I know you don't. But, for example, you know, when Paul Albrecht brought out his translation in 1997, it was a new, completely revised translation that was far more idiomatic and far closer to the way that Aranda people speak. But his comment at the time was that the language had changed so much from 1956 to 1997 that we needed a new translation. That's actually not quite right. The language hadn't changed, the way of translating had changed. Because in the 1970s, John Fitzner, Paul Albrecht and others basically swept out literal translation and replaced the 1956 Strello translation with a new one. And they also got rid of the diacritics. The diacritics were probably relevant up to about 1950. But after the advent of the Summer Institute of Linguistics and modern structuralist linguistics, they were just in the way. They're no longer necessary.
Any other questions quickly? Yes.
We talk or we speak about the Aboriginal culture and language. Do we know how many Aboriginal languages have we lost? I mean, there are many tongues, Aboriginal tongues, but we haven't lost a lot of languages. Do we know how many we've lost so far?
Yeah, how many not spoken anymore? It's a bit hard to say because a lot of languages are being revived or that are being spoken by very few people. Yeah, so out of, say, 200 or more languages originally and maybe 600 dialects, there's about 13 that are said to be spoken by children, that children are learning and growing up with. Only 13 out of that number. So that's a huge loss. And so these are ones that have been acquired naturally, learnt naturally in the home by children. But when we look at the map of Central Australia, where Fink River Mission has been working is Aranda, Lurija, Vidinjara, Alyawra and Madjara. All of these are living languages with children learning them. So there's 5 languages out of 13 which are still viable. And they're all within that Lutheran mission area.
Any other questions quickly? If not, I'll invite Brian Jeffries to come forward and move a vote of thanks.
Thank you, David. There's a group of us that have been meeting the last few years in Alice Springs on a Friday. Max here, Broadway, and Peter Altus, who's now, and David, Paul Traeger, myself, and a few others. But it's a great honour just to thank you for your presentation. Over the last few years, you've opened up for me a much deeper understanding of the contribution of people like Pastor Scherer or Philip Scherer to the cultural heritage of Australia. But earlier in the year, David, you helped organise the Friends of the Strello Symposium with your wife Susan, with Glenn Orricht and Olga Radke. And Olga spoke so fondly of Philip Scherer toward the end of his life when she was living at Tanunda. And we launched, as you said, this book. And one of your passions was the mission of the Lutherans, from Killapanina, Bethesda to Hermannsburg, but to the west. And I read this book just this week again for the second time, which is really a facsimile, the Scherer papers. And I could see December the 23rd, 1923, Nathaniel and Maria Jacobus and Alma were commissioned, to go into the literature country. But I noticed the footnote by Philip Scherer saying, yes, but how thorough they were. They'd done reconnaissance already into the literature country and also to the south and to the west. And I thought, what detail that he's left for us to read. Over at Toowoomba 2 weeks ago, I was at church, Anglican, and met Andrew Kuckel. And he said, my grandfather was at Killapanina as a stockman and then Hermannsburg. And I looked at the book, there sure enough is a photo. So it is a wonderful legacy. But thank you very much for sharing, your great love and passion for the work of mission in Central Australia and drawing our attention to the work of the Holy Spirit, which is still at work in Central Australia and beyond. And I guess for me, just showing me that to learn language, to have an understanding of linguistics and anthropology is to understand the people, and then, we can do mission that way. And to the Scherer family, I've only just met Andrew. It's an honour to have you here. Thank you, David, and thank you, Jeff.
Thanks, Brian. I don't know if many of you know Brian Jeffries. He comes to quite a few of our meetings now. He's a retired Anglican priest, and he was for quite a long time a priest in Alice Springs. Yeah. And so we're welcoming him here. Now, mention was made about these diaries. People brought 10 copies here tonight, I think. They're $40 each. There's only 3 left. And they haven't got any more available in Central Australia. So if you want them, see Sue down here. You got the other one. I won't argue, but anyhow, if you do want one, they're $40 each, and they're well worth it. I'm hoping too that the Scherer family were happy with the presentation tonight and learnt a lot about their father and grandfather. I knew him quite well in later life. I went to his funeral, and for a number of years he was also chairman of the Barossa Valley Archives and Historical Trust, and I was already treasurer then, and it's a long time ago. So, and he was a committee member there as well, and I certainly met him at different times when he was archivist of the Lutheran Archives. So I think you should be very proud of the work that Pastor Scherer has done as a legacy to us and an inspiration to your family. So we come to the end of our meeting, but there's one sobering issue that I feel I need to raise with you. You may recall our meeting last month when we had a lot of visitors here, and one of our members had her car vandalised in the car park. She was in the car park behind the church hall, and she had one of the side windows of her car smashed in, She advised the North Adelaide congregation about it. It was reported to the police. She was very traumatised by it, and she's not here tonight. The window's been completely repaired and was covered by insurance. But the reason for my raising it tonight, and I spoke to her on Sunday about it as well, and she's happy for me to talk about it. The police want to know if there is anybody else either here tonight or who watching on live stream tonight, whether you had a car out in that car park and it was damaged. The police believe it was a random act of vandalism, and the case report is still open. So if anybody else did have any problem with their vehicle, please let me know. Also, it happened during the course of our meeting, but if anybody saw anything untoward out there, should also let me know as well, because the police want to know that, and we really can't pass the word on without mentioning it at a meeting like this, because it was a concerning issue. And she doesn't know why she was targeted, and but it did considerable damage, and fortunately the people could replace that window quite easily, apart from all the fragments of glass inside a car. Nothing was stolen, but it shouldn't happen. So if anybody has had that misfortune last month, because we don't know, there were other cars in that car park, don't know if any other car was damaged, but please let me know if you had a car damaged or somebody watching it tonight, to let us know so that we can inform the police. Shouldn't happen, should it? So, look, thank you all for your attendance here tonight. We welcome you to come back next month. I presume there are people here who had intimate involvement in the Hermannsburg mission, would that be right? Hands up for people who... Yeah, so there's quite a few here. So welcome as well. So you're all welcome to stay for supper over in the church hall and continue fellowship over there. And you may like to sort of speak to our valued guest speaker again, who got paid 2 bottles of wine for his trip south. Thank you.